Our first reading comes from the essay Guiding Principles for a Free Faith by James Luther Adams. Religious liberalism depends first on the principle that revelation is continuous. Meaning has not been fully captured. Nothing is complete, and thus nothing is exempt from criticism. Liberalism itself, as an actuality, is patient of this limitation. At best, our symbols of communication are only reference and do not capture reality. Events of word, deed, and nature are not sealed. They point always beyond themselves. Not only is significant novelty both possible and manifest, but also significance is in itself inchoate and subject to inner tensions of peril and opportunity.
James Luther Adams, or JLA for short, as we called him in seminary, was the great theologian of 20th century Unitarian Universalism. He wrote the passage that Anne read in response to conversations with German theologians after the Second World War. He was trying to define liberal religion by what it was, rather than what it was not. So working with the idea of David's 5 smooth stones, the ones David used to slay Goliath in the Bible story, JLA wrote about the 5 smooth stones of liberal religion. The first stone is revelation is continuous, not sealed. And another way to think of this is that we are part of a living tradition. So this is not exclusive to Unitarian Universalism, of course. JLA was writing in this essay about liberal religion at large as he understood it. And during these days of Rosh Hashanah, let's think first of our Jewish neighbors and Jewish Unitarian Universalists who affirm that Judaism is an ongoing conversation with an ever-growing symphony of midrash, commentary that continually deepens the tradition. And our neighbors at First Church and South Church in the United Church of Christ would affirm this by saying, God is still speaking. And they write it with a comma, not a period. And the list can go on. The traditions we have inherited are not in their final editions. They are still in beta. Still, after hundreds or thousands of years, we continue to evolve, to receive and grow new wisdom. This is not necessarily an easy growth. People disagree about what is essential to their faith, whether that's a belief or a promise, and how we know whether we are innovating or betraying. It's a struggle. The Reverend Mary Catherine Moore preached a sermon this summer that pointed out that believing in a living tradition requires us to make peace with the fact that just as many of us no longer hold to a 200-year-old version of Unitarian Christianity or Universalist Trinitarianism, which were both radically liberal Christian traditions in their day, the ones from which our living tradition has nominally descended. Just as Unitarian Universalism has moved through those beliefs into its present day form, our tradition will continue to grow beyond us. This is the promise and the challenge of the living tradition, of liberalism in practice. We will be outdated. And you know what? May it be so. My deep hope is that the fight in 200 years is not for the inherent worth and dignity of all people, is not for Black lives to matter, is not for every person to be fed and clothed and housed and loved, not to free prisoners and all that. Of course, that is present-day Unitarian Universalists and people of goodwill of all faiths and none, but it also reaches back to Jesus of Nazareth and before him to the prophet Isaiah. A long line going back, interweaving and intersecting, threads diverging and meeting up again. A long line back through the ages, calling for justice and working for it, balanced by the line going forward, the one we can't imagine yet. What will it be? And how can we make sure that our struggles now become so beautifully outdated? Not sure whether to end this thought with a comma or a question mark, or to simply take a breath and hear some music.
Our second reading is The Seven of Pentacles by Marge Piercy. Under a sky the color of pea soup, she is looking at her work growing away there actively, like the grapevines or the pole beans as things grow in the real world slowly enough. If you tend them properly, if you mulch, if you water, if you provide birds that eat insects a home and winter food, if the sun shines and you pick off the caterpillars, if the praying mantis comes and the ladybugs and the bees, then the plants flourish, but at their own internal clock. Corrections are made slowly. Sometimes they grow underground. You cannot tell always by looking what is happening. More than half the tree is spread out in the soil under your feet. Penetrate quietly as the earthworm that blows no trumpet. Fight persistently as the creeper that brings down the tree. Spread like the squash plant that overruns the garden. Gnaw in the dark and use the sun to make sugar. Weave real connections, create real nodes, build real houses. Live a life you can endure. Make love that is loving. Keep tangling and interweaving and taking in more. A thicket and a bramble wilderness to the outside, but to us interconnected with rabbit runs and burrows and lairs. Live as if you liked yourself, and it may happen. Reach out. Keep reaching out. Keep bringing in. This is how we're going to live for a long time. Not always, for every gardener knows that after the digging, after the planting, after the long season of tending and growth, the harvest comes.
Balancing not between past and future, but now and now. We don't know what our harvest will be. We don't know what the political future holds. We don't know what the next few months of pandemic will hold. But twice a year, we get a moment when night and day are equal. At the spring equinox, we were just figuring out how to be in this pandemic. As we look to Tuesday's autumn equinox, we have a better idea of how the virus spreads and which precautions are most necessary. And right now, here in Hampshire County, our risk level is low. And it's higher, but not alarming in Massachusetts overall. It turns out that obsessive surface cleaning is not as helpful as we originally thought. The structure of the virus is pretty fragile. Keep washing your hands though, which is always a good idea. But sanitizing your groceries turns out to not be necessary after all. The virus spreads as best we know, and we know a lot more now, through droplets and aerosols, frequently by people who don't know they're infected yet. Two people with whom they share a long time in their presence or emotional intimacy that draws them in close. Droplets from one person's breath out to another person's breath in. So keeping that good distance helps. Aerosols lingering in the air after someone else has been in a room. So airflow is important. Whenever possible, being outside is best. And keep wearing your masks whenever you're with people who are not in your household or your pod. This is hard. It's hard for people who live alone and may go months without another human touch. It's hard for people who are spending too much time with their families. It's hard for people who are on Zoom all day, including teachers and kids doing in-person learning. Something's got to give. We are not meant to live like this. I'm not going to lead you into the streets to protest for doing things the same way we were in February. I'm not leading an anti-mask rally here. I will remind you to please keep wearing your masks, keeping a healthy distance, and washing your hands. Religious community, the way we understood it 6 months ago, is not feasible right now, at least not in the sense of having Sunday mornings together in person. Singing, being close together, lingering in conversation, but saying, let's do normal life because I can't do this anymore, is a dangerous temptation. So I ask you, what's the one thing you really need to give you the strength to keep going? Could you do this longer if you had a friend to pod up with, even if you don't live together, just to be unguarded in each other's company? You could both get tested and have a conversation about your safety protocols, you know, how often you go shopping and who else you see in this intimate and unmasked way. And it's not just single people. I've heard of families forming pods so their kids can play together close up without having to worry about who has what. Could you do this time if you had outdoor distanced picnics? If you had a regular park date with a friend? If you went to protests without feeling guilty about being near people? And can you give up the other stuff to make that one thing happen? Could you quarantine for 2 weeks before and after, if that's what it takes to visit your parents? Can you get your flu shot? So at least that is less of a worry. Can you invite your friends over to your porch or patio instead of your living room? Can you give up the mask that fits too loosely to be a thorough protection? Can you give up restaurants? What are the extras you give up to make your necessary risk possible? Usually when we talk about faithful risk, it's about civil disobedience or something like that. Reverend Dr. William Barber, though, phrases those risks, like when you're risking arrest for a higher cause, as acts of moral obedience, obeying your conscience, obeying a higher call than the law. This faithful risk, I mean today, is discerning the risk you need and choosing to be as safe as you can the rest of the time. This past Wednesday, the board voted to approve a staged COVID response policy for in-person gatherings. So don't get too excited. We are a long, long way from filling up our sanctuary again. We're ready to begin hosting outdoor gatherings with masks and limited numbers and appropriate distance. Hymnal and RE materials pick up this afternoon, and the river cleanup day on Saturday will be the first events. And Rebecca and I are making plans for supplemental RE activities that the kids can do together outside or in the backyards with their families, depending what feels like the right thing for each family. We will get this policy out to you this week. It's staged. So when the risk increases, we'll go back to a more protective stage. And when the risk drops, we can come together as appropriate for the current risk level. And we are going to keep our core programming online this year. This is one way our congregation is embracing the idea and holding the tension of faithful risk. It's a balance, risking well, keeping the mental health and the bodily health as best you can. And it will look different for each of us, depending on what our bodily needs are, what our social needs are, what our family's needs are. Each of us is called to risk well, to risk faithfully for what really matters, to take care of each other